I was hired in 1991 to rebuild the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. It was called the Department of Afro-American
So
Studies.
tell us that story, because that's an important piece of what you've done.
Well, the department was, it was an empty shell. It was down to one professor who was from Germany, a very brilliant man, Werner Zollers, and one student. And the students had taken over a building and demanded that, as students do, or used to do anyway, demanded that the university fix this. And it was the last year of Derek Bok's presidency.
So one thing to remember is that people remember the 60s and the tumult on the college campuses as being primarily an anti-war protest. But there are also another half of it which people don't recall, which was the African Americans who were new to many of the Ivy League schools wanting their history and their literature taught as well.
And what we didn't know.
And that's another piece of it that people forget, and this was an outgrowth of that. Is that a fair description?
That, absolutely. And I was part of that group, but we didn't know what it meant to create a real academic department. We just wanted to be black. All we knew was it would be black. We used to tell jokes. We'd have a course on the black uncle and the black aunt, black family reunion. We just didn't know what it meant. All we knew, well, to illustrate what Glenn said, the class of '66 at Yale had 6 black men to graduate. The class that entered with me in 1969 had 96 because of affirmative action. And affirmative action was not a mechanism for non-qualified people to be admitted. It was a way of dismantling historically racist quotas on the number of black people who matriculate at historically white universities. Yale had a quota on Roman Catholics until 1963. And Lord knows it had a quota on Jewish people. So what affirmative action did was allow us to compete in a real way and to show up and perform for the first time in an unrestricted way. So we get there, and there's no black presence in the courses, so students demanded that, and they created programs. But many of these programs or departments were embarrassments, really, academically. They were created so the students would not blow up the library or burn it down. And many cynical administrators just figured, if we can only get these kids out in 4 years, right, these academic institutions will implode. And then we could say it was a mistake and then just move on. And that's basically what happened at Harvard. And there were some places where Afro-American Studies was great, like at Yale, really, really great academic entity. But at Harvard, it never really got off the ground. Harvard in 1981 hired a brilliant historian, Nathan Hutchins, who hired this man from Germany, Werner Zollers. But they were the only 2 people there. Everyone else was transient. And they had a handful of students. Then Nathan died of pancreatic cancer, leaving Werner Zollers. And that's when the students took over the building, and that's when Henry Rosowski called me. So I hired Anthony Appia, my dear friend, who's a genius. And we had been together at Yale, at Cornell, at Duke, and now we had a chance to build African and African American Studies at Harvard. Why, you might ask, was this important to me? My PhD, my BA is in history. I was a Scholar of the House at Yale in history, American political history. And my PhD is on the 18th century in English literature from the University of Cambridge. So why was it important to me? Well, I think that the last barrier for African Americans to cross in terms of victories over racism will be the barrier of intellectual prejudice. The belief that somehow we are naturally inferior. And I think that that's an attitude that's pervasive, not only, as I've found, unfortunately, in the United States, but in Europe, and even in Latin America, and even in Asia. People think that somehow, in general, this is a horrible generalization, that people of African descent have athletic ability, but you wouldn't turn to them to populate a department of physics or math. So to me, creating an academic entity at one of the world's greatest institutions, full of brilliant people, white and black, gay and straight, American, European, African, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, wherever they came from, built on the most sound and rigorous academic principles, would be an implicit political victory for our people. And that's what I set out to do. And I'm very pleased that I think that that's what we did.